Well, we have the habit here with the J.K. Russell Fellowship of beginning with the contribution of our guest scholar and then a crossfire of other learned opinions and views. And we've really had a good morning, a rich morning, I think, amplifying basically what it is that Celia had presented. I know I came here this morning with the idea that this is a new subject area and I want to learn as much as I can. And so far, that's been happening. This afternoon we've got 4 more respondents, and the period between now and 3:30 or so is dedicated to that, and then after a break we're going to come back for general discussion. James Haag will be our first afternoon respondent. Jamie is a doctoral student here in the field of systematic theology with special interest in the dialogue between science and faith. He's currently working on his dissertation. The last I saw, he had 6 chapters in the well. And the topic is emergent freedom, process dynamics in theological, philosophical, and scientific perspective. He's been sort of our resident expert in sociobiology amongst our doctoral students. He serves as the managing editor of our journal, Theology and Science, and if you don't know that journal, it's time to subscribe. Jamie.
Thanks, Ted. Thanks to Celia for engaging paper. I'm probably going to push us in a slightly different direction than we've been going so far. Hopefully it will spark some interesting conversation. I asked for some generosity at the beginning because, alas, I have no animal research in my background. Yet I will be speaking about some animals today. So, my response will focus on the beginning section of Celia's paper, emphasizing 2 themes. First, if we assume that animals do in fact act morally or immorally, then I contend that we must move a step back in our analysis. That is, according to Celia, moral and immoral acts are the result of responsible choices, the ability to make decisions, and freedom of choice. If this is the case, and I agree that it is, then establishing whether non-human animals have freedom necessarily needs assessment prior to questions of morality. Second, I raised some questions about the very possibility of non-human animals acting morally or immorally. Certainly there are comparisons between human and non-human animals that offer qualitative distinctions and not merely quantitative ones, such as language. As anthropologist Terence Deacon has argued, language is a unique development in humans. There are no simple languages in other animals, just other forms of communication. Is it possible that morality is the same way? The distinction between these themes involves a separation between responsibility in general, my first theme, and moral responsibility in particular, my second theme. So to the first. The question I want to ask is this: do non-human animals, specifically non-human primates, possess enough freedom to be responsible for their actions? This may sound like an odd question. For some, the jury is still out on whether humans possess freedom. So any attempt to find antecedents in other animals is premature. For others, it is so obviously apparent that freedom is rampant in the natural world that the answer to this sort of inquiry is already obvious. While I do favor the second group, the view that freedom does exist in the non-human world, it is necessary to establish the type of freedom that is present. So a brief overview of the popular contemporary solutions to the freedom dilemma will help locate the potential for non-human freedom. Most scholars identify determinism as the stumbling block for notions of freedom, varying from causal and genetic to theological and logical. To this issue, there are 2 prominent camps. The first, known as compatibilism, is the assertion that freedom and determinism are not mutually exclusive. As its title suggests, they are compatible. Despite all the happenings in the history of the universe being necessitated by what has occurred before, along with the laws of nature, freedom remains possible. This is maintained by claiming that freedom is essentially just a matter of not being constrained or hindered in certain ways when one acts or chooses. Having psychological impairments, being tied to a chair preventing movement, having a gun to one's head all represent instances where freedom is denied. In this sense, freedom is merely about being able to act and choose according to one's preferences at a certain time. The second group hold that freedom and determinism are incompatible. Incompatibilists want a considerable concept of freedom where alternative possibilities are available to the actor and the action is not necessitated. From here, there's a noteworthy split in the incompatibilism camp. One group claims that freedom is only possible if indeterminism provides a type of causal slack where the individual is able to act. The other group maintains that free actions require an alternative kind of causation, where actions originate directly from within the agent or self. While I believe that both incompatibilism and compatibilism are extensively flawed, I nevertheless explore compatibilistic freedom as the more likely source of non-human freedom. One important contention for establishing freedom is the agent's ability to act otherwise. That is, it is assumed that blameworthy and praiseworthy actions can only be assessed if other courses of action were open to the actor. However, contemporary compatibilists argue that this is an inappropriate expectation and claim that the ability to do otherwise is not required for holding someone responsible for their actions. Philosopher Harry Frankfurt has conducted numerous thought experiments to show, quote, a person may well be morally responsible for what he has done, even though he could not have done otherwise, unquote. So let's consider one of these experiments using a chimpanzee as an example. Imagine a researcher has control over a chimpanzee's behavior through manipulating electronic probes or drugs. The chimp is presented with two stacks of food, stack A and stack B. If the chimp attempts to choose stack B, the researcher will intervene, not allowing stack B to be chosen and forcing the chimp to choose stack A. If the chimp attempts to select stack A, the researcher does not intervene. Obviously, if the chimp is forced to pick stack A, freedom is absent. However, when the chimp picks stack A initially, it seems evident that we hold the chimp responsible, despite the fact that stack B was never truly an option. This example puts forth the thesis that one needs not have alternative responsibilities in order to be held, alternative possibilities in order to be held responsible for one's actions. I think that many non-human animals meet this basic requirement. It requires a deflationary notion of freedom, where being the locus of a certain process is the only qualification. This sort of freedom is played out in many scenarios. If a dog attacks a child, we hold the dog responsible, regardless of whether the dog actually was unable to do otherwise. Instances in law where someone pleads insanity do not exempt them from responsibility. It might change the punishment they receive. Perhaps they are sent to a mental hospital instead of receiving the death penalty, but they remain culpable despite an inability to do otherwise. This compatibilistic type of freedom is common and affirms that non-human animals possess enough freedom to actually be responsible for their actions. Most of the work done concerning non-human animal choice involves behaviorism and genetic determinism. Do animals actually make decisions, or are all behaviors instinctual and therefore stimulus-response conditioned? Certainly, Mark Bekoff and others have had an uphill battle against animal behaviorists. I am sympathetic to the search for animal freedom, but skeptical on the issue of moral freedom. This brings me to my second theme. One of the problems with the chimpanzee example is that it does not exhibit a moral situation per se. Typically, morality is thought of as a system of rules, virtues, or ideals that influence behavior directed at lessening the harm of another. That is, morality is not simply about benevolent behavior, but it is benevolent behavior undertaken for a specific reason. So let's consider a situation where one's actions influence the state of another. There's a popular example involving macaques that is a good example. One macaque is in a setting where food is provided based on the macaque pulling on a chain. However, there is another macaque in a separate area, in view of the first, who receives an electronic shock anytime the chain is pulled. The first macaque can clearly see the discomfort of the second upon tugging the chain. It is reported that some macaques will refrain from pulling the chain despite a lack of food being provided. The researchers noted that some would resist for several days. One instance noted a macaque restraining for almost 2 weeks. The question is whether these macaques exhibited moral behavior. To get at this question, I want to explore a possible parallel example. Scientists Terence Deacon and Ursula Goodenough claim, quote, symbolic representation is a novel emergent semiotic capacity found only in the human, unquote. Deacon argues that the coevolution of the brain and language gave rise to possibilities never before seen in the history of the cosmos. The world is composed of rocks and trees, but the human world is more than tectonic and organic processes. Symbolic entities such as institutions, rules, or values are as real as the rocks and trees around us and help us to frame our worldview. As Deacon argues, these meanings are not somehow in the world, simply waiting for our discovery. Rather, our ability to form complex symbolic networks is directly related to the evolution of enlargement in the human prefrontal cortex. What this means is that meaning itself is an evolutionary emergent feature of the universe. Meaning construction is therefore a complicated web involving our symbolic reference and the reality that we encounter. Our ideas thrive and entangle in one another to such a degree that we are able to conceive of impossible realities. As Deacon notes, quote, in what other species could individuals ever be troubled by the fact that they do not recall the way things were before they were born and will not know what will occur after they die, unquote. With this in mind, I am saying that symbolic representation makes moral and immoral behavior possible. In our example, is the first macaque able to symbolically represent the state of mind of the shocked macaque? Or is the first macaque merely interpreting the signs of the second and arriving in a parallel emotional state? Deacon develops a representational hierarchy of icons, indexes, and symbols. So the macaque clearly exhibits iconic or contagious empathy. There may even be instances where certain macaques exhibit indexical or predictive empathy. However, symbolic or representational empathy is never reached precisely because the macaque lacks the ability to represent the mind of the other macaque. I am aware of the complex literature on non-human animal theories of mind. However, I view the numerous examples cited in the literature as tremendously difficult to interpret. For instance, do theories of mind differ from the lab setting to instances in the wild? Without going into great detail, I believe that a theory of mind involves multifaceted interconnection of indexical and symbolic relationships, an ability that is apparently exceedingly difficult for non-human animals. It is certainly possible to act pro-socially without the use of symbolic representation, but to know that one has done so requires that the act be self-represented in symbolic form. To satisfy symbolic thought, the macaque must refrain from pulling the chain not only because it is believed to be the right thing to do, but must be done intentionally based on its system designating right and wrong. My claim is that, like language, morality is impossible without symbolic representation. I think Celia's acceptance of Bekoff's assertion that we must assess animals in their own world is appropriate. Many times, however, extrapolating backwards to simpler minds leads to significant distortions of both ourselves and non-human animals. Looking for morality in the non-human world may be an error of this very type. So identifying latent morality, or forms of morality, or proto-morality, or quasi-morality in the non-human world misappropriates the term, in the same way as looking for latent language or proto-language. When we look for morality in the non-human world, we project our capabilities onto other animals, thinking the relationship is analogous. I believe the better route is to notice the crucial differences and look for other antecedents. There certainly are pro-social behaviors prevalent in non-human animals, but morality is not pro-sociality in abundance. Interestingly, this disjunct between human and non-human behavior has even more forceful repercussions when considering what we might call antisocial behavior or human immorality. The ability to represent alternative future pathways is an amazing skill. However, it also leads to what might be the most atrocious of behaviors. Different forms of torture are reliant on an ability to represent the pain and suffering of another. Imagine a scenario where a criminal holds a gun to the head of a loved one, demanding that some delicate information be revealed. It is neither the criminal nor the gun directly that forces you to give up the information. Rather, it is the representation of a future occurrence, specifically your loved one being shot. Add your ability to imagine the future, years into the future, without that loved one, and the situation can be horribly overwhelming. Torture victims on occasion have said that the expectation of agonizing experiences was as dreadful as the act itself. Because of symbolic ability, this dark side of human behavior falls outside the realm of non-human activities. We do not say that the macaques who continued to pull the chain for food, despite the other's discomfort, were engaged in torture. Morality makes human responsibility something quite different from non-human animal responsibility. In a footnote to Celia's paper, which she mentioned earlier, she notes that our views have changed slightly since her 2004 book, The Ethics of Nature. There she writes, quote, reading into animal behavior, moral agency in a strong sense, as morally culpable is a mistake. There remain crucial differences between animals and humans that should not be underestimated, unquote. She does not simply want to, quote, absorb animals into the human moral community. Rather, she wants to expand what we mean by morality and resist the urge to assume that the way we construct human morality is the only way to conceive of moral or immoral relations. While rethinking terms is certainly a needed method in both theology and science, I'm a bit skeptical that we will solve the problem of non-human and human distinctions or relations by shifting these definitions. The comparative difficulty when it comes to symbolic ability is an instance where simple associations or resemblances fail. In an effort to notice the differences, however, we must make a concerted effort to avoid dualistic positions that dichotomize the human and non-human world. History has certainly proven us guilty of elevating ourselves to a dominant position, and as many have noted, the results of this egotism have been catastrophic. Equally as troublesome are reductionistic approaches that affirm a moral monism, where human morality is seen as a more complicated version of animal morality. A middle ground position emphasizes that behaviors we find in the non-human world are the necessary beginnings of human morality. Philosophically stated, these characteristics are necessary, but they are not sufficient. While we must note where discrepancy arises, we should avoid claims that identify physiological differences as the key component. As Deacon argues against Noam Chomsky's view that we possess a language faculty in the brain that supplies the universal grammar, I would dispute ethnologist Mark Hauser's recent argument that we possess a similar moral faculty that delivers judgments of right and wrong. A lack of morality in other species is not the result of something simply missing in their brains. I would argue for an emergence viewpoint on morality. Thinking in hierarchic nested terms, we can recognize that pro-social cognitive biases are a necessary basis for morality, but which only becomes a basis for morality after symbolic cognition restructures it with respect to the ability to simulate another's experience. This allows me to affirm the claim made by Deacon and Goodenough that, quote, given that we have evolved from an intensely social lineage, we're uniquely aware of what it feels like to be pro-social. And it is the awareness of what it feels like to be moral, this moral experience, that undergirds and motivates actions of a moral person. Certainly, rethinking our claims on human morality and its antecedents in the natural world will likely shift our perspective on theological notions like theodicy, atonement, and redemption, as Celia has pointed out. But I will not say anything about that for the moment. Thank you.
In a moment, I'll open the floor for discussion. I'm wondering, Mark, if you'd like to offer anything about animals, symbols, language, and then we'll follow you with our.
Yeah, I don't agree with Terry Deacon at all, and I know him well, and I know Ursula. I mean, one of the things that they wrote before a lot of the work on mirror neurons was published. And for those of you who don't know what mirror neurons are, do you know? You want to know quickly? Okay. In the prefrontal cortex of monkeys, there are neurons called mirror neurons. And they work as follows. when a monkey, say, reaches for a pencil, this is the original experiment, neurons fire. When a monkey sees another monkey do the same act, their neurons fire. So the mirror neurons fire not only when the monkey does something, but when he or she sees it. And lots of philosophers have taken off. I mean, it's really a huge field. Time magazine in January had a special issue on the nervous system, and they said that mirror neurons are basically the DNA of cognitive studies. That's how important they are. So the reason I mention that is the claim that other animals can't get into the heads of other animals is not quite so. There's ample evidence now. The other thing is we need to go beyond language and, once again, visual stimuli, because there's no doubt they communicate using other modalities. And those
Is that what led Aristotle to say, monkey see, monkey do?
could be. Well, monkey see, monkey... No, actually, monkey see, monkey feel. And Alvin Goldman and a bunch of philosophers have been writing some really interesting papers about how mirror neurons are the basis for shared intentions. The other thing is that just this past fall, another finding was that mice show empathy. A hardcore scientific study, and when they looked at the neural basis for empathy, it was the same neural basis as in humans. So the reason I say that is, once again, when we go out and look, we find these things. So,
Did you want to respond to that, or?
As a non-scientist, my conversations with scientists about mirror neurons, both neuroscientists and Terry and Ursula, have been that a lot of the interpretation of those are fairly premature. But again, I just can't speak to it.
no, I mean, I think we get into an ideological battle here. I mean, Terry wants this. I mean, I could say that. I mean, I could come up with an exclusive definition of what it means to be a dog, and I could exclude dogs from being dogs. So I think asking other animals to be symbolic creatures is asking them to be creatures who they're not. I mean, that's just how I look at it. You know, once again, there's plenty of things that animals can do much better than we can do, and we can easily then draw the boundary there and say, well, you know. Anyway, it's an interesting.
I think I'm making a similar claim, that asking animals to be moral is asking them to be something they're simply not. On the basis of philosophical understandings of morality, that, in my sense, it's more than just play.
More than just...
More than just play.
Uh-huh. Oh, okay, I see that. We'll get into it later.
I think the example though that you used was problematic, the chain pulling of the monkey. I think nobody who uses that particular example would say that this is an example for morality. It's actually showing that they have empathy, and even less than that, they have emotional contagion. So most people working in that field, from the scientist's point of view, most ecologists would say that what this shows is really that you have a response hardwired, and it brings in the mirror neurons, but basically that there is actual response wired into the brain. So I think you would be hard-pressed to find a lot of scientists calling that necessarily moral.
Well,
especially since it's not within the natural...
In the connection I was making between, there's not a distinction that we can make. Morality without empathy isn't morality. And so the claim is that a theory of mind is necessary for empathy.
True, but I don't think that a lot of people would call this a theory of mind.
Well,
I think that's...
Mark just said empathy in mice is an example of morality. And I'm saying, as this example...
Oh, no, I didn't say that.
Example of empathy, not...
No, I didn't, right, I
And
didn't
I'm
say...
making the connection between empathy and morality.
Yeah, but that's a pretty fast move.
Yeah,
I didn't say that mice were moral, I said they were empathic.
that's right.
No, I mean, I really need to draw that. But we can talk about that later. Yeah.
I'm just wondering if there's a lot of, we asked the question, what is intelligence? Going back to the Greeks, they thought it was the rational mind. And so without the rational mind, supposedly you can't have symbolic activity, right? Would you agree with that?
I wouldn't want to make a quick jump, as I was just accused on rationality.
Oh, it was friendly, actually.
No, I'm just, now we're saying intelligence is much broader. than what the Greeks thought. You have all this literature now on emotional intelligence. So maybe part of this problem is trying to define what is intelligence. Because if you push it back, you can't have morality without some form of intelligence, right?
Probably not. I doubt if there's morality before life.
So pushing this back, aren't we talking about what is intelligence?
I'm not sure. I think that...
Can you have morality without some form of intelligence, which would be some form of knowing?
I'm probably saying no, though I think if we were to define morality in a certain way, we can find similar examples of behaviors in very simple animals that would probably fall into that line, but I wouldn't be inclined to say no.
So instinctual behavior could not be, would have to be some form of knowing, some sort of knowing of some option. Yes or no, right or wrong. Am I just asking the question? Did you both agree on that?
I think it hangs on how you define intelligence, and the reason I say that is because, for example, birds are now known to be much more creative manufacturers and users of tools than chimpanzees
Right.
in some cases.
Well, that's a form of intelligence, right?
Well, it might be, but I think biologists tend to look at intelligence in terms of what a species needs to be able to do to be a member of that species. So in other words, we don't have the phenomenal capability of using ultrasound or infrasound like other animals. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
And so I think that the received view now is that intelligence is really species. We need to take a more species-specific view. Or else we could I could easily just say, well, since humans can't do something that a bat can do, we're not as intelligent. I mean, I don't mean that, I mean that seriously.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the comparative views of intelligence are really the ones that are being
Wouldn't that
predominant.
support his view then? If you say that it's species specific, then you cannot make a real, you can't really, philosophically, you'd have to have a true analogy between the two A and B. There'd have to be something analogical for it to be, I mean, that's what it seems to come down to.
But if you think that symbolic thinking, and some people might agree that Kanzi, who Sue Savage Rumbaugh studies, is using symbolic thinking when Kanzi uses lexicograms, then it depends on the cognitive capacity on which you focus. It depends what you choose to make your line. It's kind of...
Our time for this segment has evaporated, but let's see if we can get it in order.
Thank you for your thoughtful response. I think it helps clarify some issues. But one thing I do want to suggest is that we mustn't confuse morality and ethics. I think you're tying in morality to symbolic ways of thinking. It's actually a way of expressing morality as a form of ethics. In other words, it's about a detached form of rationality according to certain rules that we set up ourselves, as it were, looking into the future is one example you gave. That capacity is more, as I see it, a particular system of ethics that Stephen Clark would say is not possible within the animal world. If we say that, then we're trying to force them into human capacities. So what I mean by morality, and what I think Mark means by morality as well, is something a bit different. It has to do with forms of ethics which connect more with emotion, virtue, and that kind of thing, which is much more linked in with instinctual evolutionary behaviours. So I think the version of morality that I'm seeing it in relation to the worlds of animals themselves. So in that sense, it's not necessary to have symbolic meanings in order to negotiate it. And in addition to that, I have a student doing some research on symbolic meaning negotiation. And what she says is that in our making, she's a social anthropologist, I think if we bring in the research of social anthropologists rather than as well as philosophers, what they say is that actually our ways of thinking symbolically is de-differentiated. It's de-differentiated thinking. That is thinking that's almost pre-rational. So in that sense, there is a sense there in which even our symbolic making capacities could be then linked in with some of the capacities that we find in animals, even if they don't themselves form symbols in quite the same way. So, if you like, I think you're assuming two things. One is that symbolic thinking is linked with rationality, which I'd say it is true to some extent, but that could be argued on the basis of social anthropology. Secondly, I want to distinguish between the more sophisticated forms of ethics and more forms of ethics which connect with our emotions, like Martin Nussbaum and others have suggested. And then thirdly, we need to respect animals within their own worlds and not. We use the word morality, but that doesn't mean to say that it is exactly the same. So we have to try and, like I said, ground it in ethological research. So although, and I don't think there's another word that we can use at the moment. We can think of another word, maybe you wouldn't feel so comfortable with it, but what we mean by it, I think, is very important, and I think may give some problem with the...
There's one comment for later is that I agree that your move following Mark to think of animals in their world is the right move. The question I'm asking is, when we do that, why bring such an anthropomorphically loaded term like morality? To look at them in their own world and then pull this sophisticated notion of morality from humans, even trying to find it in their world, I just find that problematic. I don't even really know what that means. Like you said, I think antecedence is possible, and I like the term pro-social, but I think using the term morality is, even when we look in their own world, there's a difference between anthropomorphic and anthropocentric, and I think the morality term leans towards the anthropocentric side. Even if we're saying, well, it's not the same. Well, if it's not the same, then let's not even call it. That's the proposal I have. Excuse me.
That's an argument for continuity. The problem that you run into there is what happens if my joy and my empathy are different from your joy and your empathy, which they likely are. Then we would have to conclude one of us doesn't have it. But I would debate that we both have it in a different form. And I think the reason that we use those terms in ethology is to stress continuity.
Continuity with distinction.
Well, yeah, but then the problem, I mean, then the problem...
That's the middle ground. We don't want to dichotomize between either we have more of what they have or we have something different.
No.
It's a forced choice.
But it's a different... But I'll say one thing Sue Savage-Rumbaugh found in terms of symbolic thinking is while bonobos use trail markers to tell bonobos who are following but who have lost sight, sound, and smell of them which direction to go. That's just a fact from field.
There's an interesting side note. At our STARS conference in Cancun, Sue Savage-Rumbaugh said in the group that Deakin's notions of symbols was the only correct one. Just as a note.
No, well.
Thanks, Jamie.
Sorry to cut this off, but we will have open forum for general discussion later on, so if you still have something hot to say, don't let it cool. Our next speaker is Nate Hallanger. Nate also is a doctoral student here in systematic and philosophical theology at the dissertation level. The topic of his dissertation is Atonement for Evil, Soteriology and Theodicy, and Theology and Science. Nate is already in the world of publishing. He's our book review editor for the journal Theology and Science. He's co-editor of the Festschrift in honor of Bob Russell, published last year, called God's Action in Nature's World. And he's the program administrator for the CTNS STARS program. So the next star rising.
Thank you, Ted. Well, first off, let me thank Bob Russell for inviting me to respond to Celia's paper, and to Celia for providing a very interesting paper that raised many, many more questions than I can address in the brief time this afternoon. But in general, I think her paper has focused attention on what has become a difficult problem for us in this field we call theology and science, and that is the relationship between theodicy and evolution. So in my remarks, I would like to address three issues under that broad rubric in brief. First, I want to think about the scope of what concerns us theologically in nature. and how we might go about deciding what that scope is. Second, I'd like to think a little bit about the relationship between morality and sin. And finally, talk just briefly about the nature of atonement. But before I get to those issues, I want to say that I share Celia's broad concern for our theological reexamination of various theological loci in light of what we discover about the nature of nature, especially concerning evolution. And I think in this field of theology and science, especially in this country, we want to distinguish ourselves from creationists of various kinds, as well as the many and growing adherents of intelligent design in our attitudes toward evolutionary theory. The result is, sometimes we tend to make facile statements that evolution is simply how God creates. But as Celia's paper reminds us, this overlooks the dark shadow side of evolution, a process rife with pain, suffering, extinction, death, and, as she described this morning, a moral latency that suggests a capability for something like sin in the animal world. Interestingly, as we move toward greater recognition of this shadow, I just thought of this the other day, some scientists are looking at the other side of this question. I heard Richard Dawkins on Fresh Air last week, and he was asked by Terry Gross about the ruthlessness of evolution and of human behavior. And his response was very interesting to me. He said, well, that's not the interesting question. The interesting question is why we produce so much good. So, just an interesting juxtaposition that here we theologians are asking the question of evil, whereas the scientists are asking, why the good? Just an interesting side note. Also, I want to briefly mention what I think might be an important category, and it actually just came to me this morning when I was listening to the other presenters and to Celia present her paper, and that is relationality. I think there's an increasing recognition that humans are not simply the solitary enlightened selves who create our own worlds. Rather, we are social beings. This should not be a surprise to anyone, whose very selves, in fact, are constituted by our relationships. Furthermore, I would argue that this relationality is not simply limited to other human beings. Part of our relational selves is our relationship to and with the natural world. So, might we take this a step further? Well, we could go further and argue in parallel to Celia's argument about morality and say that there exists a deep relationality in nature. The complexity and contextuality of operations on the micro level, say of inside the cell, suggests that nature might be at base relational, or even contextual, if you want to be even more precise. Obviously, that's an assertion that would need greater fleshing out, and I, as a theologian, need to rely on scientists to do that for me. But I think a lot of the work has been done. Even a mere ecological sense of the natural world moves us, I think, towards this conclusion. If that is the case, then there are warrants for valuing nature both as valuable in relation to humanity, which I think has been the traditional way of doing it in an instrumental sense. I'm not arguing for an instrumental view of nature here, but I think we might also argue that nature is relational in its own terms, as Celia argues about morality. These notions of relationality, I think, have implications for our understandings of redemption. If we and nature are relational, then I think redemption, too, must have some relational component. If we are to be who we are as relationally constituted selves, and if nature is to be nature relationally. Well, let me move now to the 3 points that I wanted to discuss, the first of which is the scope of our concern. So this seems to me to be a key question in our reflections on the natural world. Basically, the question is, which parts of nature really matter to us theologically? Are we concerned mainly with things like majestic eagles or hawks or beautiful birds? Or are we just interested in primates? Are we just interested in mammals? Are we just interested in cute puppies and kittens that are on our calendars? Is emotional relationality the key here? Or might something else drive our considerations? If it is emotional, we should ask why we have a positive emotional reaction to pictures of cute animals like you saw this morning in Mark's presentation, or pictures of great apes holding kittens. And ask why these feelings don't arise when we look at a catfish. The question behind this inquiry, I think, involves a choice about what's important to us in terms of our relationality to creation, God's creation, theologically. Typically, this is involved in an examination of capacities, be it rationality, emotion, sentience, ability to experience pain, or something else. Classically, Descartes sets the agenda here. He argued that because animals have no rationality, no immortal souls, and no perception of things like pain, we humans have no responsibility to act morally toward animals. One obvious result of this, in Descartes' time even, was that vivisection, the process of anesthetizing an animal and then sort of slicing it open to see how it works, vivisection has no moral connotations. To Descartes, animals are essentially machines that show no evidence of internal thought or emotion. Here's a quote from Descartes that actually is interesting in light of Mark's presentation. Descartes said, "Seeing that a dog is made of flesh, you perhaps think that everything which is in you also exists in the dog. But I observe no mind in the dog, and hence believe there is nothing to be found in a dog that resembles the things I recognize in a mind." So for Descartes, those beings with a mind fall within the realm of moral obligations, while those apparently without a mind fall outside. So under this schema, if we're concerned about who's in and who's out in terms of moral obligations, we have several options. One, obviously, is to change the capacity that matters. Maybe you're only concerned about beings with a heartbeat. Or maybe there's some other capacity that you would like to be of main concern. Another option is to challenge Descartes' assertion by arguing that animals do indeed have the capacities that would place them within the bounds of moral obligation. And I think Mark's work you heard this morning would provide key data in this regard. However, one might also challenge the very notion of basing moral obligations on capacities in the first place. But more about this in a moment. In the context of Celia's work, the question surrounds the nature of atonement and redemption in relation to this notion of capacity. And who and what needs redemption, and who and what need redemption for what and from what. In her words, quote, "How deep does what seems to us to be immoral behavior or sin go in the evolved world?" End quote. Finding out how deep such behavior goes in the natural world necessarily leads one to rethink theologically who needs redemption from sin. As she notes, discovering the depths of sin in non-human nature leads into questions of redemption from suffering in the wider scope of the natural world. The question this raises for me is whether the determining factor for what matters about animals is their ability to exhibit some form of latent morality. I'm not suggesting that the focus leads one to neglect the rest of non-human nature,